This is DW News, live from Berlin. No change, a message of defiance from Vladimir Putin, vowing to press on with the war in Ukraine. The Russian leader uses the annual Victory Day parade in Moscow to justify the invasion, saying he's defending the motherland and rails against NATO. Also coming up, fighting back, the Black Sea port bearing the brunt of Russia's fresh offensive. The governor tells us people are resisting despite widespread destruction. And a dictator's son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., heads for a landslide election win in the Philippines. The man known as Bong Bong takes a commanding lead over his main rival, with nearly 2/3 of the votes counted. Hi, everyone. I'm Layla Harak. It's good to be with you. Russian President Vladimir Putin has praised his armed forces fighting the war in Ukraine and promised to push on with the invasion. Mr. Putin was speaking at Moscow's annual Victory Day parade celebrating its 1945 defeat of Nazi Germany. Thousands of troops and military vehicles paraded through Red Square. Mr. Putin repeated his claim that Western countries provoked the attack on Ukraine. Well, he went on to claim falsely that Western countries plan to launch attacks in eastern Ukraine, that Ukraine tried to obtain a nuclear weapon, and that he launched his so-called special military operation only after exhausting every other bid for peace. Take a listen.
Russia called on the West to an honest dialogue, to search for reasonable mutual solutions, to take into account each other's interests. All in vain. The NATO countries did not want to hear us, which means that in fact they had completely different plans, and we saw it. There were open preparations for another punitive operation in Donbas, for an incursion into our historic lands, including Crimea. Kyiv announced possible acquisition of nuclear weapons, and the NATO bloc started active military colonization of territories belonging to us. So an absolutely unacceptable threat for us was created directly near our borders.
And here with me on the set is DW reporter Aaron Tilton. He has worked extensively as a correspondent at our Moscow bureau when it was still open. So good to have you here on the set with me, Aaron. I want to start off by asking you, a lot of analysts have expressed surprise at what Mr. Putin did not mention during his victory parade speech. Were you surprised?
Yes, to a certain extent I was. I mean, all the chatter we've been hearing out of intelligence circles and by analysts is that they were expecting a greater commitment of military assets from Vladimir Putin today. Basically, the current operation in Ukraine is still considered on the part of the Russian government to be a special military operation. That means they can't bear the full force of their military and direct it on Ukraine. And a lot of people were kind of expecting to see kind of a call for a general mobilization, more drafting, conscripting of new soldiers, and a full declaration of war on the part of the Russian Federation. We didn't get that, and that did seem to surprise a lot of analysts. Instead, what we saw was, basically an attempt by Mr. Putin to reframe the narrative of the war, really kind of change how the international community and also his public views their operations in Ukraine at the moment, rather than a declaration of full war, as many analysts expected.
That is really interesting. I want to pick up on what you just mentioned there, that changing of the narrative. It seemed, but he's actually made it look like this was an existential battle for Russia.
You're very much right. An existential battle is really the right way to look at it. He constantly put this in connection with the historic struggle of the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany, because that was literally an existential threat that was threatening the Soviet peoples. Basically, you have to remember, Germany under Hitler basically said they were going to absolutely eradicate the Soviet Union, that they were either going to commit genocide or enslave the Soviet peoples. So for them, it was an existential threat. And you have to remember, the Soviet people suffered more than any other major nation when it came to the effects of World War II. I mean, there were 27 million people who died directly in the battles. Now, Mr. Putin constantly tried to invoke those images of that struggle against Nazi Germany. While he didn't mention Ukraine very often in his speech directly, he constantly said that this was a fight against Nazis. This was a fight against these radical nationalists, and tried to frame it in that language, that these are an external threat, that Ukraine somehow presents an external threat because it is somehow governed by Nazis. Now, of course, we know that's not true. That does not gel with the facts on the ground. You can't forget that President Vladimir Zelenskyy is, of course, a Jewish man who was elected democratically. So it's not even fathomable that there's some type of Nazi control of the country. But at the same time, Vladimir Putin was constantly using that as a tool to basically frame this as a giant conflict between East and West, and one that really is an existential threat for the current Russian Federation.
He was essentially weaponizing what was a very painful a part of Russia's history and to justify the invasion of Ukraine. But the end goal of this war still remains very ambiguous. I mean, he didn't clarify anything. I mean, what is he going for?
Exactly, and I think that's actually intentional, because you have to remember, it does seem that Mr. Putin and his intelligence service thought that they were going to steamroll the country. They thought they were going to be able to bear the entire brunt of their military on Kiev and really just steamroll the country. Now, they have gotten one black eye after the next from the Ukrainian people, because, to be absolutely honest, it really seems like, despite the incredible amount of money Russia has pumped into the military in recent years, it's not up to snuff. Like, they really underestimated the tenacity of the Ukrainian people when it comes to defending their home country. And to be absolutely honest, you know, it's the same mistake the Soviet Union made in Afghanistan. It's the exact same mistake the United States made in Iraq and Afghanistan. You should never underestimate a people who are defending their home country. And because of that, because Vladimir Putin can't really point to the successes, those concrete successes that he probably wants to, I think he's playing his cards a little bit closer to his vest. Instead of actually giving us concrete definitions of what victory looks like, he's instead used this Victory Day parade to basically tell his people that this is going to be a long fight. It's not going to be over in the next couple of months. It's probably going to go into the winter and probably into next year. That's what this whole point of his speech and his preparations today, they were basically pointing to the Russian people and say, look, we got a long fight ahead of us. We're not giving up.
All right, Aaron Tilton, DW correspondent, thank you so very much. It was good to have you here for that analysis. Appreciate you. Ukraine marked the end of the Second World War a day earlier, hosting Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and U.S. First Lady Jill Biden. In response to Russia's Victory Day, President Vladimir Zelenskyy released one of his trademark video messages.
There are no shackles that can bind our free spirit. There is no occupier who can take root in our free land. There is no invader who can rule over our free people. Sooner or later we will win. Because someone is fighting for the Father Tsar, the Führer, the party and the chief, and we are fighting for the homeland. We have never fought against anyone. We will always fight for ourselves, for our freedom, for our independence, so that the victory of our ancestors was not in vain. They fought for our freedom for us and won. We are fighting for freedom for our children, and therefore we will win.
DW correspondent Fanny Fashar is in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, and I asked her how this highly anticipated day is being experienced in Ukraine.
Depends really where you are. Us being here in Kyiv, you see probably people behind me enjoying the sun. However, the picture is changing if you go obviously towards the Donbas region or to the southern part of Ukraine, where there have been a lot of rocket attacks, not only today, but also over the course of the weekend. Here, however, people, the question that I actually keep hearing from people is, why was there no clue in that address by Vladimir Putin, in that 11-minute address to his nation, any clue when this may be over? And in fact, as we listened to the speech ourselves, there wasn't anything that could tell us when this war is going to be over or what kind of roadmap Putin has to what he then calls victory. So this level of uncertainty, this unpredictability of this entire situation, this is what keeps people on edge, apart from the regular air raid sirens that we also keep hearing over the entire weekend, but also today. And once again, the government was calling on people to take these air raids seriously, the air raid sirens rather seriously, and go look for shelter. Also in Kyiv, the situation is rather normal, rather calm compared, as I say, to so many other parts of Ukraine.
The war has moved to the east. What has been happening there?
especially the focus is on Mariupol. In fact, that town is a town that's now being controlled actually by Russian forces. The 100,000 people there reportedly can only leave their homes if they have some sort of a permission by the Russian forces on the ground. However, there is one spot that's still in the Ukrainian controlled hands, to say so, and it should be kept this way, according to the Ukrainian soldiers inside that steel plant. However, we are hearing that, according to Ukrainian information, there is currently a storming taking place, apparently by Russian forces. So we do not know exactly. That picture is really difficult to establish what is currently happening inside or around that steel plant. But it seems like this is really the last stand there of Ukrainian forces. And it seems like, especially now with a symbolic day like May 9th, that it may be that the Russian forces really just would like to declare victory over that steel plant, even though, as I say, victory has been already declared over Mariupol on April 21st.
And in conclusion, Fanny, some final thoughts from you. The war has entered a third month. How has it changed Ukraine?
In so many ways, it would really exceed even airtime. It's not just obviously that 10 million people have been uprooted from their homes. Millions, more than 5, have left this country. Not speaking about the number of casualties. Only yesterday, that school that's been shelled in the Luhansk region, you really ask yourself, how is that possible in 21st century that civilian infrastructure, innocent people are in the midst of all of this, while there's Russia, the neighboring country, claiming this is just a military operation and they want to denazify this country. But also on a different term, you have to know that Ukraine is seen as the breadbasket of Europe. And while this war is ongoing, millions of tons of grains simply cannot leave this country because the main ports on the cities, we just mentioned Mariupol there, but also Kherson, Odessa, all these towns along the both the Azov Sea but also the Black Sea are blocked currently. So even President Zelenskyy just today actually underlined that there must be some help from the European partners there to help these grains, basically food, leaving Ukraine to avoid that there is a world food crisis which is lingering already.
Fanny Fashar reporting from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Thank you very much for your continued coverage, Fanny. And the city of Mykolaiv is on the front lines of the war in southern Ukraine. It's been hit by Russian attacks time and again since March and is blocking an advance by Moscow's forces towards Odessa. Our correspondent Matthias Billinger accompanied the Ukrainian army on the front line near Mykolaiv and spoke to residents who've lived through the onslaught.
Suburban dreams shattered, lives destroyed by 8 Russian bombs. The southern Ukrainian city of Mykolaiv has been plagued by bombing and shelling since the beginning of the war. Alexander was sitting in his garden in early March when 2 planes flew overhead, dropping bombs.
There were explosions. There was white smoke everywhere. It took off the roof and the fence. Over there, 2 people died. It was a clear day. They were flying low. They must have seen that there are no soldiers here, just us civilians.
Fighting continues in the region during our visit. It was here in Mykolaiv that the Russian advance was stopped. Now the city is blocking a Russian advance towards Odessa. But the price is destruction. In late March, the governor's residence became a target. This building was hit by a Russian Caliber missile, the obvious target being the governor, who has been one of the most important public figures during this war.
Good morning. We are from Ukraine. Last night they bombed and bombed and bombed.
We are from Ukraine. The opening line of Vitaly Kim's daily video has become famous. Being at the front line, his videos are watched all over the country. The governor is a close ally to President Zelenskyy.
We have no chance for now to get through our defense, so I don't think they had no forces to get through our defense for now, for a couple of days at least.
For now, pressure on the city has eased. A priority is to restore water supplies. For 3 weeks now, the taps in the city have run dry.
We are fighting and overcoming all difficulties. We always hope for the best. I think hope for the future and optimism are probably characteristic traits of the Ukrainian people. Nothing can break us.
So new technologies in life.
Within the next week, the city administration has promised tap water will be running again.
Well, May 9th isn't just Victory Day in Russia. Many ethnic Russians around the world are marking the occasion. This includes those living in Latvia, a former Soviet state which is now an EU member. Thousands of people came out to commemorate the day in the capital, Riga, despite government restrictions. Latvia has one of the highest populations of ethnic Russians in Europe. And DW's Paula Marcusa is standing by for you in Riga at the Soviet Memorial. Good to have you with us, Paula. This year's commemoration, we understand, has been overshadowed by the war in Ukraine. How are people in Latvia, where you are experiencing this day, compared to previous years?
Well, despite the calls by state security services for Russians to stay at home this year to avoid looking like they side with an aggressor country, there's still thousands of people coming and going throughout all of the day, laying their flowers by the monument behind me. But they do it very quietly this year. No usual celebrations that we saw in the previous years, previous to the restrictions that were put there by the COVID pandemic. So certainly it is very different this year, and it is not by choice, but because of the restrictions enacted by the Latvian government. The day has actually been marked a day of mourning for Ukrainian victims in a sort of attempt to try to divert the attention towards the war in Ukraine. And there are certainly people dissatisfied with the government's ruling, and some people are even trying to disregard the rules here, trying to play loud Russian music or come here wearing Russian symbols that are banned here. But the police force is on high alert and they react quickly. And I also have to say the atmosphere is quite tense because of the polarizing character of the event. Historically, what for Russians was the liberation from Nazi forces, for Latvians it meant the continuation of another brutal occupation regime. So there is clearly this division among ethnic lines in the society here.
DW's Paula Marcusa reporting from Riga, right outside the Soviet Memorial. Thank you so much. The son of the former dictator Ferdinand Marcos has taken a clear lead in the Philippines presidential election. With nearly 2/3 of votes counted, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has twice as many as his main rival, Leni Robredo. Marcos Jr. did not present a clear policy platform during the campaign, but he's expected to provide continuity from the hardline approach of his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte. And our correspondent, Georg Mattes, has more on a projected landslide victory for Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
Yeah, Lena, it really looks like we see history in the making here in Southeast Asia with a Marcos dynasty coming back to the seat of power 40 years after his father was ousted by a people revolution. It really looks like his son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., will make it in this race. Quite an historic moment for the Philippines.
And I understand he has a similar approach, a strongman approach, I should say, to outgoing President Duterte, but no real policy platform?
Well, one indicator for that is that he has teamed up with Duterte's daughter. And the concern here by many, particularly in the south of the Philippines, where there is a stronghold of his biggest opponent, Leni Robredo, is that the authoritarian style of rule that Duterte has used in the past 6 years will now even worsen under Marcos Duterte team approach, with the daughter of Duterte being the vice president in the country. Really, one has to see what comes out of that. When you talk to people, a concern, of course, is whoever wins this race. It has been such a divisive campaign that healing those wounds, bringing the people back together will be essential. That is one of Marcos' key promises, and many of his supporters hope that he will make true on those promises.
Now, I understand you're at rival Leni Robredo's headquarters. What have reactions been there to these early preliminary results?
Well, of course, people are disappointed. You have to understand that there was really passionate support for her, and people had hoped that they could turn around things. But what really struck me here in this election is when you talk to survivors of the martial law era under dictator Ferdinand Marcos, it really, the Marcos family, but also their supporters managed to really whitewash that era, so that you approach a lot of people on the street and talk to them about the dictatorship time, and they would talk to you about the golden era of stability and a rich country that they would like to return to, whereas the authoritarian rule, the many people killed and imprisoned, have almost been forgotten, and that's quite remarkable.
And very quickly, Georg, when are final results expected?
Well, in all the polling stations, the one you see behind me as well, they're now electronic machines, so it has been going very swiftly, and many have told me here that they expect the results in the early morning here in the Philippines.
All right, Georg Matas reporting from the Philippines. Thank you. Here are some of the other stories in the headlines right now. Sri Lankan Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa has resigned after violent clashes that left one lawmaker dead and dozens of people wounded. Rajapaksa dominated Sri Lankan politics for 2 decades. The island is facing its worst economic crisis since independence. Israeli soldiers have shot dead 2 Palestinians in separate incidents. 2 other Palestinians have been arrested on suspicion of killing 3 people on Israel's Independence Day. Violence involving both communities has surged in recent weeks. Sweden's ruling Social Democrats will announce their decision on seeking NATO membership later this week. Sweden has been militarily non-aligned for 200 years. But public opinion has shifted since the invasion of Ukraine. European Union leaders meeting in Strasbourg have restated their support for Ukraine joining the EU. They were wrapping up a year-long consultation process asking voters for their views on how to strengthen democracy and unity. The European Commission is expected to respond to Ukraine's membership bid next month. And I asked our correspondent in Strasbourg, Barbara Wesel, about the main points to come out of the deliberations.
The highlight probably from Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was her urgency to sort of stress the need for reform, because she sort of kept circling around this. And basically she said the European Union has to now make a big jump forward or it will fail, which is a quite strong message. What, of course, is on the table here are a lot of proposals, and some that are really very important for the European Union. For instance, that unanimity stops in foreign policy decisions. What we're seeing at the moment, for instance, is that ambassadors in Brussels are closed in their conference rooms and trying for 5 days now to get the 6th sanctions package with the oil boycott against Russia underway. And they have failed so far because Hungary won't play ball. Those are the sorts of things that really need to change if Europe is to have a stronger future, if it can also weather the incredible international stresses that the war in Ukraine is putting on the European Union. So that maybe was her core point.
And Barbara, speaking of the war in Ukraine, I understand they are deliberating, considering Ukraine's EU membership. Any candidate applying for EU membership, it's a very long, drawn-out process. So are they planning on speeding it up?
5,000 pages of accession papers, a huge questionnaire. Somebody must have been sitting in a bunker in Kyiv filling those out. Those pages for weeks now have been symbolically handed over today. But, of course, President Macron made it quite clear in his speech that was really sort of focusing on the support for Ukraine that the European Union is giving and will give in the future, but also for what will happen afterwards. He said, this is not a quick process. This is not going to happen within a few months or maybe even a year. But he also said that we should think again about the old ideas, for instance, of the two-speed Europe, that we could have some structural reforms in Europe that make it possible to include countries like Ukraine, like Georgia, like Moldova, and even some of the Balkan countries that are not ripe for accession in a sort of second round, second circle around core Europe, the two-speed Europe, as it was called in the past, where they have a lot of the advantages and they are included in many things and maybe only not have voting rights and be included in the main decision-making. Things like this are possible, but at the core of this is that reforms need to be acted upon very quickly now, within months even, and Macron has promised he wants to push this. Among all the many problems he has at home, he still thinks he can be the big reformer of the European Union.
Speaking of reform, some final thoughts from you, because both leaders were very bullish and ambitious when it comes to overhauling some aspects of EU treaties. Could those calls go anywhere?
This is the most difficult thing, of course, because everyone who has experience in the European Union knows this is opening the box of Pandora. This is the box where snakes come slithering out, and you never know whether you will get them back in and put the lid on this box. So there are many countries, some Scandinavian countries, for instance, who have already internally opposed this and said, don't do this. We don't have time for this. We don't have the political strength for this. Just leave it and come back to this later. But Macron has again said he wants to go for it. He wants at the next European summit even start talking about it. Whether it'll really come, I have my doubts.
All right, Barbara Weser reporting from Strasbourg. Thank you. You're watching DW News. I'm Layla Harak. On behalf of all of us here, thank you so much for making us part of your day. Up next is Tomorrow Today, our science magazine. And I'll see you at the top of the hour.